Two presenters today are Associate Professor Nicola Atwool, Associate Professor at University of Otago, and Dr. Patrick Kelly, University of Auckland, and Clinical Director of, here we go, Te Puaruruhau. Okay, so if I can introduce Nicola first. Nicola is based in the social work program at the University of Otago. Prior to her return at the beginning of 2012, she spent 6 years as Principal Advisor in the Office of the New Zealand Children's Commissioner. She'd previously worked at the University of Otago in the social work program for quite a large number of years, and had also during that time had maintained a close relationship with the Children's Issues Centre at the university as well, which is quite a famous centre, I think across certainly Asia Pacific, if not wider. Nicola also has professional qualifications in social work and child and adolescent psychotherapy, and was employed in a variety of roles in what's now child, youth and family for nearly 20 years before taking up her academic positions. Her research interests include social construction of childhood and adolescence, attachment theory, resilience, the impact of trauma on children and young people, the experience of children in care and social work intervention with children, young people and their families. Our second esteemed presenter is Dr. Patrick Kelly, who's been involved in multidisciplinary child protection practice, service development, teaching and research for 20 years. He's a paediatrician, clinical senior lecturer at the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences at the University of Auckland, and he's also clinical director, as I said, of Te Puaruruhau, the Auckland District Health Board Child Protection Team. This is based in Puawaitahi, Australasia's first multi-agency child advocacy centre. Patrick was chair of the Child Protection Special Interest Group of the Paediatric Society of New Zealand for 13 years. He was a founding member of the National Child Mortality Review Committee and the Family Violence Death Review Committee. And today, these speakers will be addressing the topic, Child-Centred Multi-Agency Practice, Challenges for Change. Please welcome them.
Tēnā koe Adam, tēnā koe Leland, tēnā koe Moana, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. You really have let yourself in for a whopper of a session, haven't you? But this is multi-agency collaboration and practice, beginning with the fact that I'd like to point out that I sacrificed my colour scheme to Nicola's. So what are we going to do? The first 25 minutes, Nicola and I are going to tackle this in sequence. So what does it really mean to be child-centred? What is multi-agency practice? I'm going to hand over to Nicola to talk about what are the challenges for change, how do we apply such principles in community practice, and in the last 10 minutes we're going to talk about, or hopefully you're going to tell us what we're going to talk about. We're going to open that for a panel discussion for questions from the floor. What this is not is a theoretical session. Although I am involved in academic research and there are lots of questions that I wish research could answer, it's not theory that brought me into this field of work, and it's not theory that keeps me here. This is a session for frontline practitioners, for those of you who go back to work on Thursday and might be called out on Good Friday. So what does it mean to talk about child-centred practice? Well, firstly, some might call me a child protection paediatrician. Actually, I'm a paediatrician first, which means that before I knew anything about child abuse and neglect, I trained for 14 years in the New Zealand public healthcare system to care for sick children and hopefully to assist them in the process of their return to health. Now that I've been working in the field of child abuse and neglect for more than 20 years, some might call me a child protection paediatrician, one who specialises in caring for children and young people where someone is concerned that they're coming to harm through abuse or neglect. It took me some time to understand that the very use of the phrase child protection risked placing me, without my even knowing it, and certainly without my choice, on one side of a debate about the whole philosophy of how one should prevent or intervene in a situation of child abuse and neglect. The debate could be caricatured as follows. There are two broad approaches to child abuse and neglect: the rescue approach, typified historically in the child protection systems of countries like the US, the UK, Australia and New Zealand, where the state rushes in to rescue the poor child and punish the evil perpetrators. Or the child welfare approach, typified in the European and Scandinavian welfare systems, which recognises the complex origins of abuse and neglect, strives to eliminate systemic drivers such as poverty, racism, social exclusion, and the toleration of violence, and uses a strengths-based ecological model to empower families. I think it's a caricature. This is not a debate I want to enter here because I don't think it is particularly accurate, and in fact I think it makes risking a caricature of the issues our societies confront. But the reason I mention it is because the first two words of the title of this presentation, child-centred, run the risk of casting us right into it, and I don't think they should. Which brings me to the issue of labelling. I don't know how many times I've sat in a multi-agency conference or spoken to a CYF social worker on the phone and got the distinct impression that I have been labelled. The unspoken words I imagine are, here we go, another simplistic, white, upper-middle-class paediatrician who thinks the answer is to uplift this child from their family and place them somewhere safe. And perhaps the social worker at the other end of the phone is imagining a word like this, here we go, at least imagining what's in my mind, another social worker so wedded to the family or their own ideology that they can't acknowledge a strategy that's failing. So I think there's a process of evolution we all have to go through if we want to do this well. And I think it's probably true that many paediatricians enter this work simplistically because we often come from relatively privileged backgrounds and we first encounter child abuse with no well thought out theoretical framework in the context of a child who's come to serious harm. There are a lot of things that paediatricians encounter without any theoretical framework: child poverty, social exclusion, marginalisation, heroic families struggling with children with chronic disability with no social support. I think it's no surprise that there are two paediatricians, Professor Asher and Russell Wills, who are probably leading some of the key charge about the impact of child poverty on health in New Zealand. But I suggest to you that it's also probably true that many social workers and others enter this work ideologically also, with a personal or theoretical framework that may not prepare them well for the real-life dynamics of working with families where children are coming to serious harm. Everybody has stuff to learn, everybody brings their preconceptions, nobody's got a mortgage on the truth and the complex dynamics of child abuse and neglect. Not paediatricians, not social workers, not psychologists, not researchers, not children, not families, not iwi, not churches, not criminal or family courts, not even members of parliament. As time goes on, most people who stay in this area at the front line have to move their position. Paediatricians move or evolve from simplisticness, if there is such a word, and social workers evolve from ideology. In my view, there's only one thing that stops us all evolving towards cynicism, and that word is child-centred practice. And I think it's appropriate to bring a child in at this point. I first encountered this child in the 1990s at the age of 12 months. I'll call him Aaron, and this is a growth chart. Any of you that's ever had a Well Child book will recognise it. He came into Starship ED with a history of vomiting for 3 days. At the age of 12 months, he could sit, but he couldn't roll, crawl, or weight bear. He was floppy, lethargic, and obviously malnourished. As you can see from his growth chart, he had gone from the 75th percentile for weight at 2 months of age, which was the last time he was weighed, until he was a year old, at which point he was 600 grams or 1 pound below the 3rd percentile. So he was obviously failing to thrive. And as part of the workup of his medical condition, we did a chest x-ray which showed several rib fractures, which led on to a series of standard child abuse investigations. To cut a long story short, Aaron had 20 fractures in various stages of healing, literally from head to toe. They're plotted here on a skeletal diagram along with some of his original x-rays. And these are 2 slides from his MRI scan, which explains why Aaron was vomiting. He has extensive subdural bleeding inside his head. almost certainly from repeated head injuries. Almost certainly on each occasion the head injury was sufficient to knock him out. So, what happened to Aaron? He ended up being placed with a grandmother, and I followed him up to the age of 3 years. At that age, he was thriving and, despite his head injuries, apparently developmentally normal. His mother was charged with inflicting his injuries, but she died of a medical condition before the matter ever got to criminal court. I was not sorry it never got to court. I was never convinced that she inflicted his injuries or that she alone inflicted his injuries, and she was in an incredibly isolated position, stuck by circumstances in an extended family, most of whom, it seemed to me, wanted neither her nor her baby. So I used his x-rays in teaching for many years, teaching paediatricians that head injuries are always in the differential for vomiting in infancy, that failure to thrive should be taken seriously, and that it's easy to miss multiple fractures in young children. All very true, all very orthodox, all very legitimate points to make. I guess the problem with being in this work for a long time is that you sometimes see follow-up. Aaron was referred back to my team 14 years later, at the age of 15. His grandmother had died a year or two after the court case was terminated at the death of his mother, and he returned to the family that had been caring for him when he first presented at the age of 12 months. In that environment, he experienced continual emotional and physical abuse. He was often kept home from school until his bruises healed. Finally, at the age of 13 or so, he began to develop very significant conduct disorders, was suspended from school. Finally, at the age of 15, he decided enough was enough. He ran away. He hadn't been at school all year. He presented at school one August, complaining of a headache and limping. During his latest beating 3 days before, he had been kneed in the head and punched on the ground until he lost consciousness. When he woke up and ran away, went to school, told first the sympathetic teacher and then the statutory authorities exactly what was happening. This time, because Aaron was resilient, articulate and determined, he was able to get the change he needed. I have no intention of making simplistic points from Aaron's life. I want to make just one point which seems simple, but is not. What is child-centered practice? Child-centered practice, it seems to me, is to let the child speak, to begin our process from the child's experience of reality. The younger the child is, the harder it is to do, but the more important it becomes. When Aaron was 12 months old, he couldn't speak, but his body could. If you like, my job was to be an interpreter, to ensure that his family and the statutory authorities knew what his injuries were actually saying. In a sense, paradoxically, Aaron was lucky that at the age of 12 months, his injuries were so severe. They earned him a few years, one presumes, of loving care from his grandmother prior to her death, and I suspect these were profoundly important in his later resilience. If he had just had a bruise or two at the age of 12 months, maybe nothing would have changed at all. When Aaron was 15 years old, he spoke for himself, and because he was able to do so and to keep on doing so, things finally took a different course. A cynical interpretation might be that it is only when we are old enough to speak like an adult that adults begin to listen. In frontline multi-agency practice, it is the situation of a child or a young person that puts us all in a room together. I don't care how you frame the context. There are always wheels within wheels. The cause of the child's situation is never simple, so none of us can afford to be simplistic. But in this room, we're not here to fight our ideological battles. Bring your perspective, your knowledge and experience, but leave your baggage at the door. Leaving your baggage at the door, of course, is exceedingly difficult to do. Yet in many ways, it's not nearly enough. If you walk out of the room, pick up your bags, and go on your way unchanged. True multi-agency practice, I believe, requires a far more fundamental change. This whole conference is entitled Cultural Responsiveness in a Multi-Agency World. It's natural to interpret this as responsiveness to cultures, and there are many here better qualified to address that topic than I. However, I suggest to you that it could also mean the responsiveness of cultures. How does a culture respond to the abuse and neglect of children? And when I use the word culture, I do not intend to discuss ethnicity, nation, or tribe as usually understood. For me, multi-agency practice is about cultural change, because every agency, whether it be a district health board, child, youth and family, or the police, is a culture. We are all tribal, and the process of learning our profession is also inevitably a process of initiation into the tribe. How we talk, the language we use, how we think, who we trust. You can push the analogy a long way, because within each tribe there are sub-tribes. In the health system, the culture within surgery, for example, may become so far removed from the culture in mental health that sometimes one wonders whether they're even on the same planet. In truly multi-agency practice, every tribe must change. Now, under the new Vulnerable Children's Act, some very large tribes have been told they have to change. And I'm speaking particularly of the tribes known as the health and education systems. So how does one do this? How does one break down the walls that divide us? What are the key ingredients necessary to transform organisational culture? To take staff whose prime allegiance is to their own profession and their own standards of practice into a place where they're just as accountable to those outside those allegiances, and above all, to the child. So the points I'm going to make are not rocket science. Competence. Each profession needs to be good at what they do and appropriately trained and equipped by their own tribe. You can't step up to another level if you are standing on a weak foundation to begin with, and you cannot advocate forcefully for your position if you don't actually understand why you hold it. Mutual trust is founded on competence. You want me to trust you? Show me that you do a good job. Time and courage. We're always time poor. There are always a multitude of things we could do with our time. We always have to prioritise. This is absolutely the case. But we should also acknowledge that we easily find excuses to avoid the things we find difficult. If there's tension in the air with another agency, the easiest strategy is avoidance. Don't answer the phone, don't reply to the meeting request, don't turn up. But tension can also be an opportunity for change if we have the courage to front up and maybe hear stuff that we don't necessarily want to hear. Working together takes time and courage. In my experience, if we don't invest the time up front, there will almost inevitably be a payment to be made later. The problem is that the cost may not be borne by us. It may be borne by the child whom we are meant to be serving. Communication. The most important thing I've learned over the years is the value of good communication. In my experience working with cases of serious child abuse, this has to be face-to-face. Kōrero. I love a good family group conference. I can give as good as I get. I would rather hear it and respond to it. I turn up to a family group conference with one person in it, my heart sinks. I turn up to a family group conference with 100 people in it, and my heart sings, because I know that somewhere in that whānau, I'm going to get someone who can engage with the issues. Emails don't cut it when you're working with colleagues. Phone calls don't cut it, or at least they don't cut it between people who haven't already established a close working relationship. Get in a room and talk to each other, face to face. Get past the labels. Get to know the person. That's the heart of our National Interagency Guideline for Serious Physical Abuse. And if you remember nothing else about interagency collaboration, talk to each other, face to face. Information sharing. I like Jane Drum's distinction between defensible practice and defensive practice. In defensive practice, we share the least information possible, making sure we minimise any possibility that someone could criticise us later for sharing it. In defensive practice, we cover our own back. In defensible practice, we hold the child's welfare foremost in our mind and we share the most information possible, determined and able, if necessary, to defend that decision later. We opened our multi-agency centre, Puawaitahi, in 2002. We were all in the same building, but it took us 6 years to get to the position that all three agencies, health, police and child, youth and family, trusted one another enough to sit down every day together and discuss together every referral that each of us received, no matter what the source was. It was perfectly defensible, but it certainly wasn't defensive. In fact, we didn't tell anybody in Wellington for several years, on the premise that by the time some head office lawyer or bureaucrat took fright, the practice would be well established and so obviously common sense that no one could pull the plug. Honesty. There's nothing so frustrating as a conversation where the real issues are never discussed, where there is an agenda driving decision-making and it's not the agenda that's on the table. There's also nothing so dangerous. Risk assessment in child abuse, just like strengths assessment, is a seriously flawed science. The best we have got is reason to believe that good multidisciplinary practice improves the quality of decisions. It's not the tool we use that confers safety, it's the integrity of the process we follow. If people are not honest, if the reasoning behind a decision is never made bare, then that reasoning can never be challenged by others who do not share your perception of the situation. And the safety of multidisciplinary practice is precisely that in opening yourself to someone trained in a different discipline and from a different background, you are inviting a different perception of the facts that you are seeing a certain way. Reasoning that is not open to challenge is, in my view, never safe. Shared language. Language we've heard a bit about already. It's a key component of culture, and the same is true of organisational culture. For example, Child, Youth and Family has spent years developing the Tuituia assessment framework and tools like the assessment triangle and the three houses. I spent years translating medical jargon into the common tongue. But how often do we talk past each other in meetings because we don't go the extra mile to identify the point of difference in language that we can all share, then work it through to a consensus? How many times have you been in a professional meeting where professionals have been prepared to put a mark on your paper framework and say, this is where you stand, this is where I stand, this is where the difference is. Let's resolve it. Humility. In some aspects of my work as a child protection paediatrician, and in fact, the longer I do this, the more of those aspects I discover, the more I know, the less I know. No matter how long you've been doing this work, there is more to learn and some things to unlearn. Every time you walk into a room, you must be prepared to listen, prepared to learn, prepared to be wrong. Pride goes before a fall. Every time you feel in yourself a knee-jerk response to another professional, stop and ask yourself, what's driving this? Physical location. In the case of my team, the child protection team at Starship Children's Hospital, Te Pūruriho, we moved out of the hospital in 2002 and across the road into our multi-agency centre, Puawaitahi. Both names were gifted to us by Ngāti Whātua. Te Pūruriho means a place of sheltering the bud, and Puawaitahi means blossoming in unity. There comes a time for certain types of collaboration where we should consider some very concrete changes. For us, moving in together with Child, Youth and Family and the police into Puawaitahi was both a symbolic act. If we want to change the way we work, we all have to be prepared to move. And a very practical act. There are some things you can do so much more easily when all you have to do is work together is walk down the corridor. Co-location is no magic fix. It's perfectly possible to share a building and behave exactly as you did before. And there's always the risk of power imbalance. Who has the most staff in the building? Who has the most space? Who is the dominant agency here? It's all tribalism in action. But on the other hand, has your agency, has your service ever stopped you to ask yourself, why are we located just where we are? Is it just organisational convenience? Is there a way to configure ourselves so we are physically more available and more accountable to others with whom we work? So the third part of our title is Challenges for Change. Okay, you might say, it's all very well to sit in an ivory tower like Puawaitahi, all very clean and easy to stay child-focused and work together when you've got a child in hospital with the kind of serious injuries that I've just described. But how does one transfer such principles into community practice? How do you suggest any agency could have helped change the outcome for Aaron between the ages of 3 and 15 years? What are the challenges for change if we truly are to keep the child in the centre of practice in the real world out there? And to answer such a simple question, I'm going to hand you over to Nicola.
Okay, so to address the challenge of growing this multidisciplinary into a community-wide approach, I'm going to revisit and expand on some of the ideas around child-centred practice, then look at multi-agency collaboration, and then I'm going to unpack the implications using an ecological framework, because it's not just about the kanohi ki te kanohi of daily practice, it's also about what's happening in our organisational cultures and at the macro level. So, the central challenge is to be child-centred and family-focused. In 1982, Fox, and this is from a social work perspective, identified two contrasting positions in relation to state intervention. She called them the kinship defenders and the society as parent protagonist. The society as parent protagonist equates to what Patrick has referred to as child rescue. They both share a concern for children's welfare, but they take different positions on how it is best addressed. And this has led to a great deal of polarisation. And in case you think, why is she using such an old reference? In 2009, in their really extensive series that was done in The Lancet, Gilbert et al. Identified the two positions that Patrick has talked about. So what are we talking about when we talk about child-centred practice? One of the things that, because I've been on about this for some time, as many of you in this room may know, I get really upset when I'm equated with the child rescue position. And because that's all about paternalism, distrustful of family, it's focused and seen to be focused on permanent placement outside family when issues are not resolvable. But this is, for me, what it's about. That image, amazing awaits. So, where has this come from? Because this isn't a language we've used until relatively recently, and I think I can track it back to Mel Smith's report on the 9-year-old girl who suffered some pretty terrible abuse here in Auckland. And what he saw was that there were a whole lot of agencies had been involved in the course of this girl's life. They had failed to share information, but more importantly, the focus had become the mother, even though the child was the focus of concern. And so he used the phrase child-centred practice to signal where he believed New Zealand needed to go. I think we're rightly proud of our legislative emphasis on the involvement of families in whānau and decision-making, but there is a downside that we don't always articulate and talk about. The rule of optimism or the belief in family sovereignty. Families are sites of conflict. You will know this in your everyday life, that there are negotiations that have to go on. And what we as adults often forget is that when in the most serious situations, there are power dynamics operating, and adults always have more power than children. And we forget that. And we forget in social work that along with all the other fundamental inequities that we deal with, is that children as individuals and children as a collective are relatively powerless, and in fact, the most powerless group in our society. We have an ambivalence about removing children, and we should be very balanced in our thinking. But what happens is that our ambivalence causes us to delay. 2 years in the life of a preschooler is a tremendous amount of critical time in their life. We embraced kin care, and that's a really good thing, but we did it without thinking about what resources many of those families would need, and they've just been left to get on with it, and sometimes it's meant further disruption for children. And the final thing is that we haven't been bringing the children and the young people with us in this process. We are very good as adults at assuming we know best. Well, we were all children once. And I'd like to echo Patrick's point that when we can start to think about consulting children, it's when we think, and there's huge variation in this, they're old enough or sufficiently developed. Child-centred practice needs somebody has to be speaking for the child, and that is nowhere more important than for our pre-verbal children. And that somebody needs to be someone who is occupying the space, has the expertise and the knowledge to represent that child or that mokopuna. And that doesn't have to be a professional. It could be a whānau member who stands up and says, I am going to take this space. And we need to be building that into our family group conferences and our other decision-making processes. So, the really critical element for me is that a child's rights perspective informs child-centred practice. And what does that mean? It means a focus on the whole child, all aspects of their well-being, not allowing our vision to narrow to something just like safety concerns and isolation. It speaks about entitlements. Every child has the right of access to the resources needed to fulfil their potential. I think that this is part of the vision of the white paper and the direction that was signalled. I'll talk about some things that I think are going to get in the way of that a little later. But we need to hold dear to the idea that every child has this right. Too often in our professional practice, we consign children to situations that we would not consider acceptable for our own children or grandchildren. That has to be the standard. May not always achieve it, but we should not be selling kids short. The other thing about the convention that people often don't understand is that, yes, I accept it was developed in a Western individualistic paradigm, but it's designed as a total package, and within it, very strong rights to belonging with family and to cultural belonging. So it is a tool that can be used for all children. And it emphasises state responsibility to ensure families have access to resources. So, if we were to work in that way, obviously, no one agency is going to be able to achieve all of that. So the research has demonstrated that parent-focused interventions do not necessarily result in improvements for children. The vision can only be achieved in the context of multi-agency collaboration to ensure that adults and children are supported in families facing the greatest challenges. So what's it going to take to make this work? I presented, I think it was in 2003, at a Children's Issues Conference, and the title of my presentation is, "If it was such a good idea, how come it doesn't work?" It was about this. And it saddens me to be here more than 10 years later, and we haven't made a lot of progress. There is agreement about the appropriateness of this way of working, given the complexity of the challenges faced by the families. But there are many examples of failure. And despite that, it's repeatedly sold as some kind of magic bullet. So there was a useful systemic review of initiatives that failed to deliver, and this was done by Valentine and Hilferty in 2012. And these are the things they found. This was across a number of initiatives. Just because case reviews identify that failures are associated with fragmentation does not mean that failure only occurs because of fragmentation. There has been a failure to address the anxiety that lies at the core of this work. And this echoes what was said by this morning's speaker about being able to live with uncertainty. We need to acknowledge the benefits of specialisation. We need people, and this has been said by others, who bring particular knowledge and skill to the table. But again, in the systemic review, they identified the role of optimism and ideas about sovereignty of family as being part of the reason that multi-agency collaboration hadn't worked. And there is a need to address the contradictions that are inherent in the dual role of support and surveillance. And surveillance is not language we like to use, but somebody has to be eyes and ears for children. And so we have to think about how we manage those challenges. So one of the criticisms of integrated models of service delivery is that they lack a theoretical framework. And like Patrick, I'm more interested in pragmatic making a difference. But we can draw on ecological theory and the more complex systems and chaos theories to support our thinking and our working in this way. It reminds us that we need to think about all of those levels when we're addressing not only the micro level of the family, but also what's happening at meso and macro. And some of these points are very similar to Patrick's, but I'm going to put my own spin on them. We don't speak the same language across our different organisational cultures. I think we need to build a shared understanding of what child-centred and family-focused might look like. And then we can have differences within that. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. Information sharing remains a major issue, in spite of reassurances that actually the Privacy Act isn't the impediment that people like to make it out to be. And I think this comes back to the notions of defensive practice. We are going to have to build respect for different roles and different approaches, and in particular in Aotearoa, New Zealand, what it means to deliver culturally appropriate services. I'm over the language of cultural sensitivity because that lets us think that we just need to be sensitive and we can be all things to all people. Well, it isn't true. When I chaired a session on cultural innovations yesterday, there was this amazingly rich 3 presentations that flowed into one another. And they highlighted those, the 2 practice-focused ones highlighted the richness of cultural approaches. There weren't very many tauiwi in the room. If we want to build our trust and confidence that other people know what they're doing, we need to expose ourselves. We need to hear what they're doing. Not that we're going to practice in that way, but we have to open our hearts to that. And I would invite all of you here to go to at least one of the streams that's on cultural innovations. Because what we did, Miripeka did this really high level of whānau ora, and as she was doing it, I could hear Pākehā voices in my ear going, what does that mean? It's just words. And so after she presented, these 2 agencies came in and told us exactly what it meant in these stunning innovations that have been developed on the ground. So we can only build that respect through that face-to-face engagement. We're going to have to be a bit clear about our roles, who's doing what and how it all fits together. Communication. You know, in social work, we think we're the experts. You know, because we all know that listening's important and responding's important. Some of the worst communication is exhibited by professionals who end up mirroring the dynamics of the families they're talking about. We're going to have to kind of rise to this challenge. I think we need to revisit our skill base. These models can only work if we know about negotiation, mediation and advocacy, and we know how to step up. You know, you don't go in guns blazing first time. You come in at the low level and you leave the guns until your last resort. We need to know about group work and how groups function and how to be positive in groups. We're going to have confidence in managing conflict. You don't, in group work, everybody who knows the models of group work, you don't get to work till you've got through conflict. Tauiwi, I'm sorry, but our culture's really avoidant of conflict, and we're all supposed to be nice. It's not going to cut it. There is going to be a need for robust conversations where we are willing to trust people to put our view out there and then listen with respect to their view and find our pathways forward out of that. And this business of working collaboratively within and across. And I'm going to elaborate on that when I look at the meso implications. Because if our frontline practitioners are going to engage in collaborative practice, they need organisations that support that practice. And they need support workers to engage in reflective and reflexive practice. Too much of our practice is knee-jerk, reactive, without stopping to think. We are never going to build multi-agency collaboration on that base. It's going to be really hard in a competitive funding environment, and I'm going to say a little bit more about funding when I get to the macro level. And the other unspoken, and Patrick's alluded to it, are the power relationships that exist between direct government-funded services and the NGO sector, many of whom are reliant on government contracts that lock them into things that sometimes are not effective or cease to be effective over time, or where the agency, because they're on the ground, can see that things could be a whole lot different. This space has to open up. And we are going to have to talk about the tensions between agencies. In private conversations, I hear a lot of criticism about that agency over there or that agency over there, and you go into meetings, it's never tabled, a plan's put together, everybody's supposed to be working together, and I'm left thinking, how's this really going to happen? And again, my plug for understanding and respect for the different approaches, and it comes back to information sharing. If you've got one statutory agency holding all the cards in terms of the information, but expecting someone else to do the work, it's not going to happen. Now, I'm really fascinated. Health and education, this is a huge step forward. Under the Vulnerable Children's Act, have statutory responsibility for vulnerable children. And that's logical, because these are the places where children are. Now, historically, they've addressed this by referring to child, youth and family. And as the threshold for entry to that very overburdened service increased, gaps got created. We've got to reel all that back. There is no buck passing under the legislation. Everybody has to be a party. And what I'm fascinated about is that when I talk particularly to education people on the front line, they don't even know about the law change. We're going to need a new way of defining roles and responsibilities, and consideration of ways in which to make our universal services more effective. So the possibility of schools and early childhood centres as community hubs, but also everybody is going to be obliged to ask, who's the client? So if you're in an adult service and you're working with parents, you no longer have the luxury of ignoring the impact of those issues on the children in that family. Doesn't mean it's your responsibility to intervene, but it does mean that you've got an obligation to be working with others to ensure that everybody is cared for. So we've got this interface between these national strategic initiatives that are creating the space for implementation at the community level. But do we have the right mix of services, and who's best placed to answer the question? So this is going to be a challenge. The government is demanding kind of evidence-based, but none of the funding contracts that I'm aware of allow for this. This is going to have to be addressed. It's a nonsense. Obviously, we do want to know that what we're doing is effective, but you don't get that stuff on thin air. So, all of the reports and evaluations of these ways of working have emphasised the importance of government leadership, strategic direction, and I think we've got some of that, and commitment of resources. So far, the emphasis has been on redistribution rather than investment. I think that is a serious mistake, and I don't think we're going to get very far. Currently, NGOs are under unbelievable stress around their own survival, around finding money. Unless we do something about that, people cannot contribute in their most creative and positive ways. And I think this is a macro level issue that is going to have to be addressed. Because the risk is, not only will we create more gaps, but some of the changes to the Children and Young Persons Act potentially could increase the flow into that service if the services aren't on the ground to support the families with the most complex issues. And we've got to get that balance right if we're not going to take a gigantic step backwards. And I just want to briefly this has been picked up already, the narrow definition of evidence, the fact that our government kind of gets fads and fancies, overseas programs that have been evaluated, but then they apply them in contexts where they've never been evaluated, like taking parenting programs to work with some of the most challenging situations. The evidence base is a bit untested in that area. And I think it's really important that we don't lose our focus on the fact that some of our best and most creative solutions have been generated here. And yes, some of those may need some more robust evaluation, but let's not just take the easy road of buying in stuff. So the other issue that I just briefly want to touch on is that a lot has been happening in the family violence space, as well as separately a lot in the kind of child care and protection space. I think that we're going to have to find a way to recognise the overlap and provide coordinated responses without losing the specialist knowledge that is in each of those spheres. This has already been alluded to. If we do not address poverty and inequality in New Zealand, it's going to undermine any attempts to provide positive change in response to both child-centred and multi-agency practice. We're going to need funding to support broad complementary training centred on understanding and implementing child-centred and multi-agency practice. That broadened responsibility for child protection is only going to be effective in reducing the reluctance or the incapacity to act if we have realistic alternatives to statutory intervention and there are adequate provision of accessible and effective services. And my final slide is just a visual image to encourage us about thinking about the way forward.